Hi everyone, welcome to another video. Last week I did a live stream video for my Patreon supporters where I orchestrated a Bach chorale for brass ensemble. It's a really short 10 measures of 4-voice chorale writing, and even in the span of those 10 measures I wanted to shape the orchestration, so I'm starting with horns and a tuba at a really soft dynamic marking, then I slowly increase dynamics, I add in trombones, then a couple of measures of just trombones and trumpets, then finally, I bring in the entire brass section. I thought it would be interesting to do a quick mock-up of this using all of the orchestral brass sample libraries that I own. This chorale orchestration will really test the library's dynamic range capabilities, as well as how effective the sustain and legato articulations are. I tested 4 different libraries out, plus I guess Noteperformer, which I'll start with here. Okay, so the first one that I tried was Spitfire BBCSO Pro. This is a library that I've had for a while, and I must admit I don't really use it all that much. And because I don't use it that often, I think I'm probably not doing it complete justice here. But I did spend a good chunk of time working on this as best as I could. So I'll play it first and then comment on it after. So some things that I like about this, with the Pro version of this library, I had access to a lot of the microphone positions. I'm using a combination of the close mic, tree mic, outrigger, and the mids. If you really know what you're doing, which when it comes to mixing, I only sort of do, you can dial in the exact sound that you want. But the mix 1 would have been probably fine too, which is I think what you get with the core version of this library. I also think that the timbre of the brass is pretty good here. I think other sections in BBCSO sound better than brass though. Some things that were tricky about this mock-up, there's only one solo horn, so I'm having to use the same horn solo patch 4 different times, and then I also have a 4 horns patch. Same thing with trumpet 1, I'm using the same trumpet patch 3 times and the same trombone patch 3 times. Instead of bass trombone, there's only a 2 bass trombone patch, which didn't really work for this orchestration, so I'm just giving that bass trombone part to another tenor trombone, which isn't ideal, but it's okay because it's not that low in this piece. For articulations in this library, I'm mostly using the legato patches, the long sustains, and then occasionally marcatos. These are generally a louder, stronger dynamic, and so I would prefer to have a tenuto, but they don't have tenuto articulations in this library, which is fine. I can mostly get away with using the longs. For some reason, I also found the trumpets to be especially difficult to work with in this library, and I think it had to do with the harshness of the attack on these long and legato patches. So what I ended up doing often was having the CC11 and 1 kind of dip a little bit just to soften those attacks. Okay, next up, here's a library that I purchased over a decade ago when I was a student working on a ton of student film scores. And I haven't really used it that much since. In fact, I realized yesterday that it wasn't even installed on my PC, so I had to download it, and I had to download the plugin software for it too. This is VSL Special Edition 1. I know there's an updated version that works in their Synchron player. I never got around to getting that version, so I'm still using the original plugin. And it took a while for me to relearn this plugin and how things differ from what modern samplers tend to do. These samples were recorded extremely dry, so I'm having to use some positioning tools, as well as the Berlin Studio Reverb plugin to add some depth. Even still, you can hear the close microphone positions, which can at times be good, especially at softer dynamics. Let's give this a listen. Comparing this to BBCSO, this is really different. For how old it is, though, there are some really nice things to it. Like I said, I think it handles the soft stuff really well. Like BBCSO, there's only one each of the brass instruments, so I'm having to use the same patch multiple times. I find that with my limited mixing skills, that tends to create problems for me, like resonance buildups and some extra muddiness that you wouldn't normally get in a real orchestral brass recording. And like I said, this Vienna Instruments Pro plugin took a little bit of time to relearn. But once I got the hang of it, it wasn't so bad. I did end up liking the different articulations, including the portados. They came in handy, although I'm mostly just using the sustains and the legatos. I would say the trickiest thing about this was the mixing, because like I said, everything was recorded extremely close. And so a lot of the plugins are necessary to make it sound like it was recorded in a space. So just for reference, here's what it sounds like with all of those plugins disabled. So extremely dry and just extremely close. Berlin Studio is doing a lot of the work to make that sound like it was more naturally recorded in a space. Okay, next up, Cinematic Studio Brass. As the name suggests, this one is more cinematic in nature, and I can't help but think it would be better suited towards a more cinematic orchestration or style, but I still enjoyed using it with this Bach orchestration. In terms of articulations, I could really only use the one legato sustain patch it has. Fortunately, I think it's a pretty good one, but if there were more tenutos or portados, that would have been really great. Like the previous two libraries, this one has just one solo horn, so I'm having to use that same patch many times, same with trumpets and trombones. Ultimately, I'm not sure if that matters in the grand scheme of things, but I always prefer to have the individual instruments. Okay, let's listen to this one. So I think this library really shines at the end of this piece when the entire section is playing. The forte full brass sound is really nice in this library. And it also comes together nicely in the mix, I think. And I think of all the three libraries so far, I prefer these trumpets the most. And again, I just can't help but think that this library would be better with a different type of piece, with a different style and aesthetic. By the way, in terms of microphones, I'm mostly using the room mics with a bit of the close added in. I find that with this library, it can get really loud very quick. So even on the Forte stuff, I only have MIDI CC going up kind of 2/3 of the way. I think if you were to max out CC1, you would get a really, really big sound, but you might run into more mixing issues just because of the way it was recorded. And it was recorded, I think, on a smaller recording stage, which presented some issues for brass. All right, lastly, this is the library that I use by far the most, Orchestral Tools Berlin Brass. So this comparison is probably a bit unfair because I use this all the time and the others not so much. This one has 4 individually recorded horns, 3 trumpets, 2 trombones, a bass trombone, and a tuba. So that really, really fits my style of writing and my workflow in general. Let's hear this through. So because I know this library a bit better than the others, I feel more comfortable choosing microphone positions, mixing, and just programming MIDI data in general. I'm using a combination of mostly tree, a bit of the ORTF mics, and some spot. It's really nice to be able to dial in the exact sound. In terms of microphone positions, though, I think BBCSO clearly wins, then probably Berlin Brass, then CSB, and then obviously VSL Special Edition last. In terms of articulations, I also think Berlin wins. Look at all of these articulations they have, plus the different types of legatos, and you can apply legato transitions to a number of these as well, including these soft sustains, which is really useful. I do wish Berlin Brass had some tenutos or portados like they do in their winds and strings libraries. I think that'd be really useful. Sometimes these marcatos are just a bit too strong. In terms of dynamics, it's probably a tie between Berlin Brass and the CSB. Like I mentioned, CSB can get really loud, but sometimes that presents problems. BBCSO dynamics are trickier. You have to use other articulations to really get to those louder dynamics. Perhaps in another mock-up video, I could try to showcase those different articulations more. VSL Special Edition dynamics are a bit limited, but that's to be expected. That was sort of a starter library, not really meant to be your main brass library. In terms of how long it took me to mock each of these up, I think Berlin and CSB were probably the easiest because, again, I know Berlin well. For CSB, I think I really only used the one articulation, so that made it quick. And after the initial learning curve, I think VSL was pretty easy to program, but for whatever reason, BBCSO took the longest, and I'm still not really satisfied with the results. I can't help but think that someone with more practice using that library would have done a better job. In terms of mixing, which again, it's not my strength, but I try to use all of the same plugins for each sample library. So a bit of EQ, some compression, and then a bit of additional reverb. I'm using Cinematic Rooms Professional. So that's it for this one. Let me know in the comments which one you liked best. As always, the MIDI file, music XML files, Dorico, Cubase, Studio One files, they're all available on my Patreon page. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.